With no further ado, I would like to welcome you to this, our last online learning program of the 2013-2014 school year. We're going to be talking today about Jewish involvement in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964. But before we get started, I just want to say a word or two about the Jewish Women's Archive and our work. So JWA documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. In this work, educators are our essential partners. You are the people who are on the ground in communities. You know what your communities need, what their challenges are, what their interests are, and you really serve as the catalysts for bringing a rich and inclusive story about Jews and America to your students, whatever age, whatever gender, wherever you are. And sort of the core of our education work is around this idea that students cannot be what they cannot see, and teaching them about historical stories and presenting them with historical role models that represent sort of the breadth of Jewish community and the American Jewish experience allows our students to imagine and build an inclusive Jewish future, and a Jewish future that sort of recognizes and responds to the changing needs and identity of the American Jewish community and of the American community more broadly. And the central piece of that work is that we use primary source documents and personal narrative at the core of all of our education programs and at the core of all of our curricular materials. So we're going to be doing some work with primary sources today, and there will be lots of opportunities for you all to participate and get involved, and we'll sort of be modeling those for you. One thing to mention, this is very short notice, and I understand that some of you might not be able to use this, but I wanted to just mention that Monday night is the deadline for our Natalia Torsky Educator Award. So this is an award that's given to any teacher who's working with 6th through 12th grade students using primary source documents that highlight the voices of Jewish women. The prize for the award is $2,500 plus $500 for your school or program. So if this isn't something you're going to do next year, this year, maybe you'll do it next year. Maybe you know someone who's a really great candidate. So I just wanted to make mention of that. And Miriam has put the link to the webpage and the application form in the chat. So I want to lay out 3 goals for this specific program. We're going to learn a little bit about community organizing and how community played a role in the civil rights movement, particularly looking at this instance of Mississippi Freedom Summer. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Jewish experience, and how that shaped people's involvement in the civil rights movement and in social justice work more broadly. And as I said, I'll be modeling some tools and techniques for using primary source documents in your communities to look at social justice through a Jewish lens. So I want to start by throwing a question out to you all. So feel free to type in the chat or speak up using your audio and share what, if anything, you already know about Freedom Summer or the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. So this is going to be a participatory program. And if you don't know anything, that's fine. You can just say you don't know anything, and we will move forward from there.
I kind of feel like a ringer, so I'm going to leave out what I know because you know it. I know a lot about
this. Okay, thanks. Okay, so not much. I've seen pictures, but I don't know specifics. Marilyn jumping in saying she knows a little bit more. So we're going to start just with some basic information about Freedom Summer. So this is a little timeline that sort of shows you where Freedom Summer happened in terms of like the most well-known period of civil rights history. So of course there was a lot going on in terms of civil rights for African American citizens in this country before 1954, but 1954 is really a common benchmark for the beginning of this period in history. And so you can see this comes 10 years after that, right, sort of building on this momentum of the sit-ins in the early 60s, the freedom rides, these examples of nonviolent direct action, the huge March on Washington, and that all sort of helped to catalyze what was going on in 1964 in Mississippi, which was really the place that a lot of people saw civil rights issues and racism most entrenched in the United States. So, as I mentioned, the Freedom Summer took place in Mississippi, though there were projects similar to it going on in other states. But this specific idea of Freedom Summer was coalition work between COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, which was sort of the umbrella group of civil rights organizations in Mississippi. So the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the organization that MLK, Martin Luther King, is well known for working with, and then the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee on a national level. And what had happened is, after some real conversations around where the movement was going in Mississippi and how they were going to get to where they wanted to go, these two groups decided to bring about 1,000 volunteers from the north to the south and to Mississippi specifically, and to send them to these places around the state where there was already some movement work going on, and they worked with volunteers in the state. What's interesting about this story is that though Jews were less than 1% of the population, they made up an estimated half of the volunteers, white volunteers, who were coming south. And these were kids who were coming from mostly affluent communities. They're, in a lot of ways, they were involved in their Jewish communities. Most of them were going to really good colleges, Ivy League schools, and well-known universities in the north. And they were coming and interacting with Southern, often poor African-American volunteers who had been working in the state. So it was sort of a coming together of these two very different communities. And they stopped on their way. There was sort of a meeting point in Oxford, Ohio, and that's where training for Freedom Summer happened. And that's where people from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, sort of introduced you to what was going to be going on and what your options were for participating. And Freedom Summer was targeted around a few different issues. One was enfranchisement and the problem of registering to vote. So there were huge barriers of registering to vote for Black people living in many places in the South, and especially in Mississippi. Often you had to take a literacy test. There are some really interesting affidavits that talk about people who were required to interpret sections of the state constitution before they were allowed to register to vote. You often had to pay a poll tax. So there were some of those barriers. There were actual physical barriers in that people would wait outside of the registrar's office, and if you came to register to vote, they might react violently to you. And then there was economic and social retaliation. So if you went to register to vote, that list often would be published in the newspaper. And if your boss found out, or your sister's boss or your dad's boss found out, you could be fired. People might boycott your business. And so there was a huge amount of risk for Blacks who were trying to register to vote and really exercise that right. And the delegation of representatives from Mississippi was a completely white delegation, even though African Americans made up a huge percentage of that population. So there were some really clear issues that Freedom Summer was trying to address, and that happened in a few different ways. So there were some people who went out and did actual canvassing. They went around, they talked to people, they developed relationships with them. They would escort them to the registrar's office to help them register to vote. There was also a popular education project in the Freedom Schools going on. So this was, in some ways, had started out addressing the need for school-age kids to have education, because the education inequity was so great in the state of Mississippi. And as the project took off, it actually happened that adults would start coming to the schools too, and they would study everything from science and math to American history and Black literature. And all of that was going on sort of in parallel to the voter registration. And then the last piece was the volunteers were working on building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which ended up sending an alternative, racially integrated delegation to the Democratic Convention at the end of the summer. So that's what they were working on there. And the project ended up creating more than 40 freedom schools. They signed up about 60,000 people to be members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And as one of you mentioned earlier, I think Miriam, you mentioned on June 21st, so right before the start of the project in 1964, 3 men went missing: Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner. They were actually investigating a church bombing and were kidnapped and murdered. And what's of note about that is that there are many things of note about it, but Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner were young white Northerners who were part of this. This was a huge reason why SNCC and COFO had decided to bring in white volunteers, is because they knew they would get publicity. They knew that it would draw attention to what was going on in Mississippi. And as you can see from this quote from Rita Schwerner, who was Mickey Schwerner's wife, she knew that too. And Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and Rita Schwerner were all Jewish. Rita Schwerner is still living. She goes by Rita Schwerner Bender now. She's very prominently featured in the new documentary that's coming out in late June about Freedom Summer, which I highly recommend. And this was sort of a harbinger of what was to come. So this was an incredibly violent summer, even by Mississippi standards, with 6 civil rights workers being murdered, over 1,000 people arrested, 80 beatings, 35 shooting incidents, and 30 bombings of homes, churches, and schools. So this was really an incredibly scary time to be going south. And remember, most of these volunteers were in their early 20s, if that, and were coming as college students, basically on summer vacation, to participate in this project. Before we go on to the next part, does anyone have any questions about that very basic background? I see a few of you have been posting in the chat also some other resources, which is great. Okay, if you have any other questions, feel free to jump in at any point. So I want to say a few words about this lesson, and Miriam put a link to the lesson plan in the chat box if you wanted to look at it more closely. But this lesson basically asks students to imagine themselves as Freedom Summer volunteers, and they learn about the experience of these volunteers through reading the primary source documents and doing some activities that are in a round robin. And the 3 central questions of the lesson plan are: why are you here? What's motivating you to participate in this? And which of the 3 projects, whether it's voter registration, working in the freedom schools, or helping to build the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, would you be most interested in if you were going to Mississippi to volunteer? So I want to start with a little activity here. So you guys can post in the chat and say which of these things do you think was the strongest motivation for Jews who participated in Freedom Summer? So go ahead and choose one of these and post it into the chat. And if you can think of other reasons, so that green box in the bottom right, if you can think of other reasons that might have motivated these volunteers, feel free to post those as well. So a few people choosing social justice. Yulia, you chose the Holocaust. Marilyn holding up this idea that in 1964, the experience of the Holocaust was still really fresh and very present in the minds of Americans. It was, in some cases, this generation or the direct generation before. Yeah. And I think all of these reasons have been cited by Jews when they talk about their participation, but I want to explore this a little bit more by looking at a few primary source documents together, just two short excerpts actually. So this would serve as the first station in the round robin. So take a minute to look at this quote that I put up from a volunteer from Tennessee named Vicki Gabriner. This is her reflecting on her activism, doing similar voter registration work in Tennessee. And if people want to sort of type in and say what you notice or what strikes you about this quote. I see Marilyn's typing in, and Miriam also mentioning that in where you lived in New Rochelle, you experienced the first and only case of de facto school segregation. So we also have a lesson in the curriculum on the difference between de facto and de jure segregation, which is really interesting to talk about today, especially looking at education and sort of the current state of our education system. So Marilyn saying, I think it's something we can relate to today, that we have social justice values that we might not realize are part of the tradition. So I think that that's really true, and something that has been resonant with students when I've worked with in the past is this idea that social justice somehow seems Jewish. We don't always, or we can't always identify exactly where that comes from. And then Vicki mentioning, this really comes from a secular tradition, this sort of lefty secular radicalism that we see very much a part of the American Jewish community. Jennifer, I see that you're typing in, so please keep typing. I'm going to move us to a second quote now. So here's another quote from a woman named Heather Booth, who was a volunteer in Freedom Summer in Mississippi. So take a look at this one and then go ahead and throw any thoughts that you have in the chat. So Jennifer, I think what you said about your own family's tradition of social action being assumed, but it didn't necessarily come from Judaism. I think we see that reflected here, right? So we had good social values, and that somehow this reflected Jewish heritage and culture. And then we have Heather Booth holding up specifically this experience of remembering the Holocaust and feeling the need that in the face of injustice, she had some sort of responsibility to join that struggle, and specifically calling out this idea of the Holocaust. So when we do this activity with students, I'll often ask them, before we get to those discussion questions, I'll also ask them to say, okay, now that we've read these things, do you have any other ideas, or would you change where you stand? I would like to just highlight these discussion questions that we talked about, and you all have already started to touch on these. Where did they learn these values? What are some things that you learned within your own family? So these are the things that we ask students to respond to. And I want to talk a little bit, just for a minute, about this last question here of whether or not we all think it matters if you know why you're doing something to help others, or if it's okay if there's not really a reason, or you can't really say where that comes from. So if any of you would like to sort of speak to this last question here, that would be great. So Marilyn typing in, talking about this quote from the Jewish American documentary, when a Freedom Summer participant said, "If someone had done this in Germany, your parents would be alive." I think that's interesting for a few reasons, Marilyn, because it also sort of highlights, if this is a student or activist talking to her parents, it also sort of highlights that generational gap. That this was an extremely risky thing for students to do. Parents knew that this could potentially be deadly. And I think the participants, if they didn't know that before, certainly knew that after June 21st. And many people talk about that as sort of a turning point for them. But there was a real tension of any young activist who was going to go and participate in Freedom Summer and the fear that their parents felt around that. And students really felt like, in some cases, like, hey, you raised me with these values, you taught me to do this, and how is it possible that you don't support me in going and living out these values? Marilyn weighing in and saying she doesn't think it matters what the motivation is. Um, that the action will motivate more thought to look about where the action is coming from. So sort of by taking action, we start to think about why we're taking action, and then that helps us to build these connections, which creates a nice spiral. Jennifer talking about interacting with people in the next gen age group, so people who are in their 20s and 30s, and how so much is about connecting the dots. And I think that you're right, Jennifer, that the experience is not foreign from the experience of these women. I think this is something that every generation of American Jews have struggled with in some way. And part of the reason why historical sources are so great is because it shows us that these questions are very much alive, were very much alive, and sometimes gives us examples for how people have approached trying to figure out the answers to these questions in the past. Anything else on these before we move on to what happens in the second station? Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do, and sorry, let me hide my little pointer here. So the next thing that we're going to do is sort of look at the why. So thinking more about this idea of why did people go south? Why did they put their lives on the line for this work? In some cases, it seemed really obvious why a Mississippian who was living this reality every day would participate. And so there's a real question about why did people from outside the state who weren't Black or didn't live this reality would participate. And to do that, we're going to do a little text study. So let me pull up. I just have excerpted a few of the documents from this lesson plan that I want to share with you. So take a minute. I will stop talking so that you can concentrate, and you should be able to scroll through this document on your own and just read through what's here and post in the chat just a summation of some of the reasons that you're reading here. So let's pull those out. Great. So as you're reading through this document, go ahead and post a few things in the chat, either reasons that you just want to call out that these people cite for participating, and maybe put them in your own words, and also which particular reasons feel most resonant to you. Imagining in a role play that you were a Freedom Summer volunteer, what might be the reasons that you would have decided? So Marilyn saying that one piece for her is this idea that this is the whole country's problem, that it's not just one region. And Mississippi really exemplified how bad it was in a lot of ways, but we know that these are issues that existed everywhere and persist today. I see a few other people are writing in, so I'll give you a minute. So Jennifer pulling out this quote, "I'm involved in this for my own freedom," which let me get I'll sync this and get my pointer out here. So this part here, the idea that, one person's liberation is tied up in the liberation of other people, and that there were people across the South who knew that there was something else possible. And Miriam holding up this idea that the North was in a stalemate. And, I think that that's actually a really interesting point to bring out, Miriam. I'm glad that you pulled that out. That the idea that when we're doing justice work, we often look to the places that are sort of the main examples of these challenges, and sometimes we miss what's going on in our own backyards, or we're not able to see what's going on in our own communities. So using these opportunities and times of studying these issues or being active in certain social justice challenges helps us also raise our awareness and draw our attention to other things that are going on. Anything else that we want to hold up here? So I would love to go back also to this piece at the top here, where Rita Schwerner is talking a little bit about why she participated. And I want to just talk about utilizing the skills which I possess. I think that this is a really central part of community organizing. It's a central part of why the civil rights movement was so successful. And when we're talking with our students who often feel helpless or sort of confused about what to do in taking action, some time to reflect on what my own strengths are, what my own passions are, and how those things can contribute to making a better world and shaping the world or my community into what I want it to be, I think is really important. So I want to hold that idea up, especially when we're thinking about how we turn the study of history or the study of Judaism and Jewish text into something that feels like something we can do in our communities, or something that our students can do and act upon. Anything else on these sort of goals and purposes excerpts here? Okay. So this will be posted on the recording page, and these are just some short excerpts of much more and longer texts that are available in the lesson plan. So we're not going to do the next part, which is what is at station 3, but there are, I think, 2 different versions of games that you could play with your students that sort of involve people taking on different roles and completing a task as a team. I'm sure that you all know or have used games like this before, but the idea is to do some sort of simulation that will allow students to then think about um, something, the idea that everyone has something different to offer, and people need different strengths and different tasks in order to make change on this large scale. And that could segue really nicely into a very practical discussion of a service learning project that you're doing or social justice issue that you want to be working on with your members or your students or your congregants, and thinking about how to turn this historical example into something practical. So if we say, what were the different roles here, that translates really well into a concrete discussion about, we're working on this campaign, or we're working on this one issue or this one project. Let's talk about what the different roles are and how everyone's going to interact with one another. Another piece that's in the lesson that's a favorite, but we're actually not going to spend time on today, is this photo study, and talking a little bit about the role of music in community building and community organizing. Miriam has put a few links into the chat here. One is for our lesson plan that's specifically on music, freedom songs, and Judaism and music in the civil rights movement. And then the second link is to the recording of a webinar that we did earlier in the year about freedom music and singing. We had a little tutorial with a community organizer who helped us learn how to write our own freedom songs. So feel free to watch that recording and use the other materials if this is something that you think that your community would be interested in. And also, as part of that, we have an excerpt from an oral history with Vicki Gabriner, who, remember, was this Tennessee volunteer. So I'm going to pull that up and play that for you all now. And we're just going to listen to, it's a couple minutes long, this clip, but we're just going to listen to a short part of it, given that we only have an hour together.
And I don't think I'm romanticizing it as I look back on it. I mean, I remember that, there were just the most extraordinary moments in that work. I remember times, being at a men's meeting inside a church and singing We Shall Overcome, and knowing that there were white people outside, in their cars, in their trucks, probably with guns, and feeling as though, the roof was just going to lift off the church, because the energy of the people with whom we were working was so intense. It was so, the struggle, they were so involved in the struggle that it was, it was palpable. I mean, it was palpable.
Okay. So I put the transcript here for those of you that sometimes, the audio doesn't work. So we have the transcript here also to refer to. And there are a few questions that go along with this. I'm just going to ask them and then I'll show them to you on the next slide, but I want us to be able to see this text. So the first question, which is a little leading, but I think is important, is thinking about which community does Vicki Gabriner feel like she's a part of? So she's talking about these two different communities, one that's inside the church and one that's outside of the church. Which does she feel a part of? So obviously here, it seems like though she may have more in common at face value with the people outside the church who are white, who some of them maybe have more money, maybe some of them are more educated, she feels more a part of the community in the church, and she connects to them through other things, right? So this palpable involvement in the struggle, this sense that they're all in it together, a shared energy around purpose that they have. And the last question here that I'd like to just chat about for a minute is this question 3 here. So based on sort of what she had in common with the community in the church and what she had in common or different from the community outside of the church, what do you think were some of the things that were important for connecting people and helping people form community in the civil rights movement, given that they were really coming from very different places? Let's talk just for a second about sort of those elements of creating and shaping community. Yeah, so Marilyn calling out the tension of having a foot in both worlds, right? So being a little bit in both worlds makes it much more intense, and I think was hard for a lot of people to develop. You know, you had to work to develop trusting relationships, and also a lot of times being a white activist puts you at a lot of risk in those communities. Miriam saying that sort of an important part of connecting people was getting to know one another on a personal level, even if it was only for a brief time. And that was certainly true during Freedom Summer. These volunteers were all housed with members of the community. So they were living with families in the community. They were eating these people's food. They were totally putting up these volunteers. And the community really held them and took care of them in that way. And you read accounts of people sort of, one person's house got raided and a bunch of people got arrested. And so the volunteers would have to go stay somewhere else. Marilyn talking about the visual element of seeing Black and white faces in one place, which seemed really unusual, especially in this time period in the South. And I think even today there's something really powerful about seeing pictures like that, or looking around a community and really feeling both the difference between you and the things that are shared. Jennifer says, becoming part of the inside community. I imagine that the early moments were spent gaining trust and confidence of the people you were there to help. Certainly. And then this idea of once you're an insider, and then you spend your summer in Mississippi, and then you go home to your university, and then thinking about, you know, you're an insider in the university community, but you also had this really different experience, and thinking about how that impacted people's relationships with each other. I think is sort of another offshoot of that idea, Jennifer. Great. So I want to move us on. I see, Marilyn, you're typing in. I'm going to move us on to the next thing because I want to make sure that we leave some time. Oh, here we go. On the other hand, Marilyn says there's the reality that there were those in the Jewish community who wouldn't put up with the volunteers in Freedom Summer because they were scared. They were scared that they would have to live with the consequences after students left. Yeah, that's really true. We have another lesson that sort of highlights that tension, looking specifically at the experience of Southern Jews who were often, if a synagogue or a rabbi or somebody's family member decided to participate in either Freedom Summer or in the civil rights movement more broadly, everybody knew that that was going on. And it was very risky for the people who were living in the South who didn't get to go back to Stanford or Yale or Harvard or Princeton at the end of their summer, but instead were living there. That was something very real that they had to deal with. And Southern whites, just as Southern Blacks did, had to deal with sort of the fallout from that, and they also faced violence and economic boycotting and social pressure in those situations. And it was really difficult for those communities to navigate, and we have some resources about that in our curriculum as well. So the way the lesson is structured, students sort of go around and do these activities, and of course you could do them all together as we've done today. And then one of my favorite pieces is sort of an extension activity. It's called Voices of Freedom Summer, and it pulls on some letters from this incredible book. It's a compilation of letters called Letters from Mississippi. And so I'm going to post a letter here, and Miriam is going to post a link to an online tool that we use sometimes called a lino board. And so what will happen is you should be just take a minute to read this letter and then click over to the Lino board in another window and write a response to the letter. So you would write as if you were Dad writing back to Sylvie. So, and you'll see that there's some sticky notes in here from the last time we did this session. So you'll be able to see what some of the other people's responses are. And Miriam, since you're signed in, you might have to move things around as people post them. Okay, Miriam, if you can't get to the Lino board with your connection, feel free to post something in the chat and Miriam or I will add it to the Lino board. That would be great. So I'll just give you all another minute because I want us to talk a little bit about these. So if you run out of time to post something, you can always post it later. Or if posting isn't your jam, you certainly don't have to do that. So let's move now, as you all are looking at the letters and thinking about the texts that we went through. I know this was sort of a whirlwind, and if we have questions or there's more that you want to talk about, now is the time. So, and I'd love for us to talk a little bit about sort of how you all see these sources and ideas fitting into your community. So this is a great time to sort of debrief or brainstorm with each other. And also, if you have any questions about how this happens and why using historical sources is useful. So Miriam saying, I can't help relating this to how Holocaust victims and resistance fighters must have felt. Yeah, there's a real parallel here, and I think also a real parallel to people who are working in contemporary justice issues and contemporary issues of civil rights. Actually, Miriam, also what you say makes me think about the importance of reminding our members or students or participants that they're constantly creating primary source documents, and we just don't know if our tweets or our emails or our Facebook posts will be found by people in the future and what stories they tell about us. And so that's a good thing to hold up when we're looking at these sources together. So Jennifer saying that these sources made her curious if women from her own college participated, and found some information from Bryn Mawr, it looks like. And thinking about, she posted a link here in the chat, so you all could take a look at it if you're interested. I'm going to pull it up. And thinking about how to incorporate documents that way. Marilyn's talking about working with younger students, 7th through 9th graders, and their sort of lack of familiarity with this period in history and how having the primary sources brings that alive. And it's true, Marilyn, the primary sources that are available to us from this period of history are so rich. The new documentary that's coming out from American Experience about Freedom Summer this year is incredible. They have oral history testimonials from many of the activists, along with some incredible video footage of like people walking around Mississippi registering voters, which is something that I hadn't seen before. And Jennifer saying, which I'm looking at now, the idea that this, the link that she posted is a blog with entries from 1964. So that's a great way to think about using 21st century technology to help us process and curate these documents. So I've also seen people who said, write a blog article as if you were this person, live tweet, thinking about something like the March on Washington or the Freedom Rides that have like a really clear timeline. What would it be like to live tweet that as if I was an activist, which is really interesting. I know there was some live tweeting of the March on Washington this year, which is an interesting way to engage with that content. And then Marilyn and Miriam sort of pulling out this idea of relating this to contemporary justice issues, that immigration is a really big one right now. That's absolutely true. LGBTQ rights are on the rise. When we're looking at labor issues, I think there are a lot of contemporary labor issues that parallel really well with that. And it's worth mentioning, actually, that, let me pull up this other site. So there's a Jewish organization called Bend the Arc, which organizes social justice campaigns through a Jewish lens and sort of with the Jewish community. And they're doing some really great work right now around the amendment to the Voting Rights Act. So I don't know a ton about it, but for those of you that have been following, the Voting Rights Act, which was passed in 1965, Civil Rights Act 1964, Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, that sort of assured and protected a lot of the rights that people in Freedom Summer were working for, was gutted. And states individually and on the federal level have really been in some ways stepping backward on the issues of voter enfranchisement and accessibility to being able to vote and register to vote. So there, I'll put a link right now in the chat to their campaign, which is called soallcanvote.org. And I know that they're mobilizing the Jewish community around this issue over the summer. So if this is something that you're interested in bringing into your community, there's a really related and tangible issue that you all could get involved with, especially those of you who are working with adults. This could be a really interesting way for you to build off of this idea. Great. What are other ideas or questions you all have? Anything that you want to toss out there before we end our program today? Excellent. Well, thank you all for coming. This was really wonderful and rich. I'm glad that you could join us. As I said, Miriam will be posting all of this material to our website and sending you all an email on Monday so that you can get whatever information you need. We're always available to chat if you're putting these programs together. And Miriam's also going to post in the chat a link to our Facebook group. So Marilyn, I know you're already on it, but Jennifer and Miriam, if you are interested in joining the Facebook group, we'd love to have you. It's a great place to say, oh, I'm putting together this program or that program, and I'd love some ideas. Marilyn, it would be great if you posted some of the resources that you mentioned in this webinar to the Facebook group so that people can find them there. Especially given that this is the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, this is a good time to be moving on learning about some of these stories. Oh, and Miriam also posted a link to the feedback survey, so please take that survey. It just takes a few minutes and give us some feedback. We'll be sending out another survey in a few weeks, sort of evaluating our whole program, and we'll use that to improve our online learning for next year. Thanks again to everyone for coming. It was great to